Sisyphus in Greek myth is condemned by the gods to be perpetually rolling a stone up a hill, after which it rolls back to the bottom, and he has to start all over again. The graphic on your front cover of your older service was I found in a Google search was absolutely irresistible. Sisyphus as a road sign. Camus says the sources vary on what exactly Sisyphus did to bring on this punishment. By one account, Jupiter abducted a young maiden. Now, I don't know what Jupiter is doing in a Greek myth, but maybe he meant Zeus, but he says Jupiter in his essay. Jupiter abducted a young maiden, and Sisyphus told on him to the maiden's father. This got Sisyphus sentenced to the underworld. But while Sisyphus was there, he put death itself in chains and released all the inhabitants, making them immortal and putting Pluto out of business. In another story, Sisyphus, near death, orders his wife to place his body in the public marketplace rather than burying it, which was a great sacrilege. But after coming to the underworld, he suspects that she disobeyed him, and he gets permission for Pluto to go back to the world to chastise her. But once there, he falls in love with the world all over again, and he violates his furlough, staying for several years. Camus writes, recalls, signs of anger, warnings were of no avail. Many years more he lived, facing the curve of the gulf, the sparkling sea, and the smiles of earth. A decree of the gods was necessary. Mercury came and seized the impudent man by the collar, and snatching him from his joys, led him forcibly back to the underworld, where his rock was ready for him. Unquote. So for whatever reason, Sisyphus is forced to spend eternity pushing a rock up a hill. Camus describes his plight in very poetic language. Quote, you have already grasped that Sisyphus is the absurd hero. He is as much through his passions as through his torture. His scorn of the gods, his hatred of death, and his passion for life won him that unspeakable penalty in which the whole being is exerted toward accomplishing nothing. This is the price that must be paid for the passions of this earth. Nothing is told us about Sisyphus in the underworld. Myths are made for the imagination to breathe life into them. As for this myth, one sees merely the whole effort of a body straining to raise the huge stone, to roll it, and push it up a slope 100 times over. One sees the face screwed up, the cheek tight against the stone, the shoulder bracing the clay-covered mass, the foot wedging it, the fresh start with arms outstretched, the wholly human security of two earth-clotted hands. At the very end of his long effort, measured by skyless space and time without depth, the purpose is achieved. Then Sisyphus watches the stone rush down in a few moments toward that lower world, whence he will have to push it up again toward the summit. He goes back down to the plain, unquote. And it is in that trip back down that Sisyphus is allowed an opportunity for reflection. And for Camus, that is the interesting point. It is the point when Sisyphus can achieve full consciousness. Quote, if this myth is tragic, that is because its hero is conscious. Where would his torture be indeed if at every step the hope of succeeding upheld him? The workman of today works every day in his life at the same tasks, and his fate is no less absurd. But it is tragic only at the rare moments when it becomes conscious. Sisyphus, proletarian of the gods, powerless and rebellious, knows the whole extent of his wretched condition. It is what he thinks of during his descent, the lucidity that was to constitute his torture at the same time crowns his victory, unquote. Sisyphus triumphs, in other words, not because he finds hope in his situation, but because he realizes that he can labor on without hope. He does not need to hold out a prospect of success or of completion. He will never keep the stone at the top of the hill. He will never have to stop pushing it. Sisyphus, my friends, is all of us. It's a common human experience to be tied up in some task which may have meaning inside the task, but viewed from outside is meaningless. Part of Camus' idea of the absurd evolved into a critique of conformity in the Eisenhower era, which critique spawned the theater of the absurd, remember that? And then the Beat generation, and then the countercultural movement of the 60s. But many of the social change movements of the 60s forsook Sisyphus's ironic detachment. The civil rights movement, the war on poverty, the peace movement, the hippie movement were all based on the premise that there was hope for a better life, and that progress toward fundamental change could give meaning to life. We strained against the stone of racism, a war, a stifling conformity, a patriarchy, and said we won't be happy until the stone is rolled away forever. We still do that in our movement. To the extent that we are true believers, we are not Sisyphus. We are not accepting of the absurdity of our situation. I remember reading somewhere that President Kennedy, and particularly his brother Robert, were fans of Sisyphus. They knew that every step up the hill was accompanied by rolls back down, but that you had to keep on trying, and that the happiness was in the trying, not in how much headway you made. They were and still are heroes of mine, and so is Sisyphus. Now, many intellectual cross-currents have flowed since existentialism and the absurd in the 50s and 60s. There was structuralism, feminism, postmodernism, just to name a few. In their light, some of Camus' flat pronouncements seem a little over the top. Take his flat assertion that the only serious philosophical question is suicide. I have, as many of you know, a particular interest in suicide because my father ended his life that way 35 years ago. It is an important and deep subject and stands at the intersection of autonomy and relatedness. But I would not say that it is the only philosophical problem. Nor would I characterize it as primarily philosophical. The sociologist Emile Durkheim made a study back in 1898, I think it was, of suicides and put them into 4 categories: altruistic, egoistic, fatalistic, and anomic. Camus' existential suicide only fits into the latter category. Someone who would kill him or herself because of a pervasive feeling of anomie, that life had lost meaning and that social ties were few. In the poem I read, Richard Cory is the most admired of men. We all want to be Richard Cory, until one night he goes and puts a bullet through his head. We do not know and will never know what leads people to that ultimate act. It may be a philosophical conclusion, or it may be a coincidence of severe depression with impaired judgment and access to a nearby